السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. مجالس الذكر, the gatherings of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the acts of worship that we seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by making sure that we attend them, because this is one of the ways to be in the state of the dhikr and remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These majalis of a dhikr are the same as the majalis, the gatherings of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions radiallahu anhum. The Prophet ﷺ would teach his companions the matters of the deen. So majalisul ilm, to learn the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to recite the Quran, to perfect our recitation. When people are in whatever gathering that they're in and the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned, this is something that we need to put the effort to be reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the hereafter, and to increase our iman with these types and matters of dhikr and remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as the Prophet ﷺ said in the authentic hadith, that there are angels, and the Prophet ﷺ, he said, malaikatun sayyara, these angels, they go all over the earth. They search for these majalis, for these gatherings of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is their only job. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them to look for the gatherings where people are sitting and making remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once they see a group of people sitting making the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would get there and they would surround them, and they would gather one on top of the other till they reach the heavens, as it's mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And when they return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best about everything, of course, and He asked them to make them witness and for us to learn the matters of the unseen. And He would ask them, how did you find my slaves doing? And they would say that they were making dhikr to you, O Allah. يُسَبِّحُونَك وَيَحْمَدُونَك. They're making tasbih, they're making tahmeed, they're making tahleel, saying La ilaha illallah. They're praising you, O Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would ask the angels, have they seen me? They say no, and this is how they're making remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, believing in Allah. And they're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Jannah, and they're seeking refuge in Allah from the hellfire. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask the angels, and He knows best, have they seen the Jannah, the paradise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared for the believers? They say, no, our Lord, they never seen it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say to them, how is it then if they would have seen the Jannah? And they would say they would make even more of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the same thing was mentioned about the hellfire. They would make more dhikr of Allah, and they would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and have more fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make the angels witness that their sins have been forgiven, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgiven their sins. And these are the people where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لا يشقى بهم جليسهم, that the one that sits with them, he would never be perished. Even someone, as it's mentioned in the hadith, that he was passing by, and it happened that he was in that gathering. He did not have the intentions to be in such a gathering, but this is where the angels, when they asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He told them that, be witness that I forgave all of them, all of their sins, and they would say, there's so and so, he's not one of them. It just happened for them that he was passing by and he accompanied them. The Prophet the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, humul qawm la yashqa bihim jalisuhum. These are the type of people where whoever sits with them, he's never to be perished. Which by itself shows then we need to look for these individuals. We need to be these individuals to start with. We need to worship Allah, make remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to be in the gathering, and to look for these majalis where the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned, according to the way of the Prophet ﷺ, and learning the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a way to implement the state of the dhikr and the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our life. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.